right, so let's dive right in today. We're looking at Guyanese politics, getting ready for some elections there. And, this news piece we've got gives us a little taste of how things are heating up.
Oh, yeah, definitely. It's Guyana's really at a turning point, and, the politics are reflecting that.
Yeah, okay, so this article we've got is from Newsroom Guyana. Jagdeo slams APNU plus AFC desperation ahead of elections, published pretty recently, January 16th. Even the title sounds like a, political drama or something.
It does grab your attention, right? And that's what it seems like Vice President Jagdeo is doing here. He's a key figure in the People's Progressive Party, the PPPC, and he's really going after the opposition, a Partnership for National Unity plus Alliance for Change. Yeah. Or APNU plus AFC.
Yeah, so he's using some pretty strong language, calling them desperate, accusing them of using racial narratives, unfounded claims. Why are these accusations such a big deal, especially in the context of Guyanese politics?
Well, you see, this isn't just like a little political these accusations touch on a long and kind of complicated history in Guyana. Mm-hmm. Politics there has often been, tied to ethnic tensions, mainly between the Indo-Guyanese and Afro-Guyanese communities.
Right. Right.
The PPPC has traditionally gotten support from Indo-Guyanese voters, while the APNU plus AFC has a stronger base among Afro-Guyanese voters. So when Jagdeo uses terms like racial narratives, it's really going to hit a nerve.
And he's basically saying they're playing the race card. I mean, that's a pretty serious accusation.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah.
And it instantly raises the stakes in this election. What's interesting is this accusation is linked to the opposition's claim that the Indo-Guyanese population is shrinking, which they argue could hurt the BPPC.
So that's where the desperation comes in. He's saying they're using these tactics because they're afraid of losing power.
Yeah, exactly. He's making them look like, they're just grasping at straws, trying to stir up fear and division to win votes.
But wait, is there any truth to this whole shrinking Indo-Guyanese population thing?
Well, that's a tough question. There has been some emigration from the Indo-Guyanese community, but whether it's enough to really impact the election, that's still up for debate. What we do know is that Guyana's demographics are changing, and those changes can have a big influence on political power. Think back to the 2015 election. The APNU plus AFC won by just 4,600 votes. I mean, that's incredibly close.
Wow, 4,600 votes. Yeah, that really shows how much each vote matters.
Exactly. It highlights just how much every single vote matters in this system.
Yeah, it makes you wonder what led to such a close race, and what might, tip the scales this time.
Right. And that's what makes this election so interesting. It reminds us that every vote has the power to change a nation's course.
Okay, so we've got these accusations of desperation, this debate about demographics. But Jagdeo doesn't stop there. He also goes after what he calls zero parties. What's he talking about?
He's talking about these new political parties popping up in Guyana, groups that he sees as insignificant. They don't have real support. He even criticizes how easy it is to register a party, saying it creates a messy field of contenders, which can confuse voters.
So Jagdeo sees these new parties as a nuisance, maybe even a threat to the established order.
Yeah, you could see it that way. He even suggests that the opposition is embracing these zero parties out of desperation to form a broader coalition, calling it a coalition of nothing that lacks vision.
But isn't forming a coalition a pretty normal political tactic, especially if these smaller parties represent real grassroots movements? Or, tap into issues the big parties have ignored?
That's what's so interesting. These zero parties could split the vote, taking support away from these established parties. But they could also represent new voices, fresh perspectives that connect with voters who are, disillusioned with the traditional political scene.
So it's not just about whether these parties are zeros in Jagdeo's mind. It's about what they represent, like potential change, a shift in the political landscape.
Exactly. And that's why it's important to understand not just who these new parties are, but what they stand for and why they've emerged. It speaks to the bigger picture of Guyanese politics, the changing desires and concerns of the people.
So are these zero parties actually a sign that people want alternatives? Could they be a force to be reckoned with in this election?
That's a great question. And it takes us to the heart of what's at stake in this election. The direction of Guyana, its economic development, and the potential impact of its newfound oil wealth.
Okay, so we're seeing accusations of desperation, a debate about demographics, and the emergence of these new parties. Sounds like this election is going to be a close one.
It definitely has all the makings of a gripping political drama. And as we dig deeper into the regional implications and the historical context, it becomes clear that the stakes are incredibly high, not just for Guyana, but for the whole region.
All right, I'm ready to dive deeper. Let's unpack these regional implications, see how they fit into the bigger picture.
Absolutely. Guyana isn't operating in a vacuum. Its political decisions have ripple effects throughout the Caribbean. And with its recent oil discoveries, the country's role in the region is becoming even more important.
Okay, so let's shift gears a bit. Let's talk about how Guyana's position on the regional stage is influencing this election.
Right. Guyana's newfound oil wealth has put it in the spotlight. Neighboring countries are watching closely to see how it manages this wealth and resources. Guyana's role in CARICOM, the Caribbean community, has also been strengthened. And its political stability is really important for regional security. This election will probably shape Guyana's approach to those regional partnerships and economic cooperation.
So the stakes are even higher than they seem at first. It's not just domestic politics. It's about Guyana's place in the Caribbean and on the world stage.
Exactly. And this brings us to another point. Jagdeo seems to have a very, direct and confrontational style. He's not afraid to go on the offensive, using strong rhetoric and challenging his critics head on.
Yeah, I noticed that in the article. He's definitely not afraid to throw some shade. Do you think that approach works with voters?
It's hard to say for sure. It's a double-edged sword. Some voters might like his strong personality and directness. It can project an image of confidence and strength.
Like he's not afraid to speak his mind.
Exactly. But others might be turned off by it. They might see it aggressive or even disrespectful. It can come across as arrogant or dismissive of other viewpoints.
So he's kind of a polarizing figure, a love him or hate him politician.
You could say that, and that's not unusual in politics. But to really understand these dynamics, I think we need to look at the historical context of Guyanese politics, specifically the long-standing rivalry between the PPPC and the APNU plus AFC.
Okay, so let's go back a bit. You mentioned earlier that these two groups have been competing for power for decades. What's at the root of this rivalry? Is it just different policies, or is there something more?
It's definitely more complicated than just policy disagreements. Their rivalry goes deep, rooted in historical and ethnic divisions, going all the way back to the colonial era and the fight for independence.
Wow.
The PPP, which started in the 1950s, has traditionally been associated with the Indo-Guyanese community, while the PNC, one of the main parties in the APNU plus AFC coalition, has historically drawn support from the Afro-Guyanese community.
So this tension between the two main political groups is partly a reflection of the country's ethnic makeup?
Yes. And it explains why accusations of racial narratives are so sensitive. These accusations can tap into those old wounds and potentially make divisions worse among voters. It's a delicate issue, one that requires careful consideration.
It sounds like navigating those historical and ethnic tensions is a huge challenge for any politician in Guyana.
Absolutely. But it also makes for a very engaged electorate. Historically, voter turnout in Guyana has been really high, often over 70%.
Wow, that's impressive. Seems like people are really invested in the democratic process. Do you think that high turnout will continue in this election?
It's tough to say for sure. But given how intense the political climate is and the high stakes involved, I wouldn't be surprised to see another strong turnout. People understand that their vote matters, and they're willing to participate in shaping their country's future.
Okay, so we've talked about a lot. Accusations of desperation, demographic shifts, the rise of new parties, Jagdeo's confrontational style, and this deep-rooted rivalry shaped by history and ethnicity. It's starting to feel like a political thriller, with this added layer of regional and global significance. What does all this mean for Guyana's future? What are the big questions looming over this election?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Well, we've focused on the political tactics and the drama. There are some fundamental issues at play here that will shape Guyana's path.
Like what? Give me the big picture.
Well, Guyana is at a crucial point in its economic development. The recent oil discoveries have brought in a lot of wealth. And the question is, how will this wealth be managed and distributed? Will it benefit all Guyanese? Or will it just end up in the hands of a few?
Right. So this election isn't just about who's in power. It's about how that power is used to manage this new wealth and guide the country's development.
Exactly. And it raises important questions about governance and transparency. Will the government be accountable to the people? Will the oil wealth be managed responsibly and ethically? These issues go beyond party politics. They get to the heart of what kind of society Guyana wants to be.
So it sounds like this election is about more than just choosing. Between the PPPC and APNU plus AFC, it's about deciding what kind of future Guyana wants to build.
You got it. It's about choosing a path forward, one that leads to more prosperity, equality, and opportunity for all Guyanese. And that's where things get really interesting. We can start to think about the different scenarios that might play out after the election.
All right, let's get into those potential scenarios. What are the possibilities here? What might the political landscape look like once the votes are counted?
Let's start with the most obvious scenario. A clear victory for either the PPPC or the APNU plus AFC. This would mean things stay pretty much the same, with one of the established parties in control.
Okay, so business as usual. But with either the PPPC or the APNU plus AFC at the helm, are there any variations within that scenario? Would a landslide victory for one party change things?
Absolutely. The margin of victory is key. If the PPPC, for example, wins by a large margin, they might feel more confident to pursue their agenda aggressively, pushing through their policies with less need for compromise.
So a big win could give them a stronger mandate and maybe change how they approach governing.
Yeah, and it could also affect their relationship with the opposition. A big win might make them less likely to listen to other viewpoints,
Right.
or to compromise on key issues.
Okay, that makes sense. What about if the APNU plus AFC wins unexpectedly? What kind of impact would that have?
Well, an APNU plus AFC victory would probably show that people want change. It could lead to big policy shifts, with more focus on social welfare programs, environmental protection, or even constitutional reform.
So a win for either side could lead to some major changes in how things are run.
Exactly. But we also need to consider the possibility of a less clear outcome. What if neither party wins a clear majority?
I'll hung parliament. Now things could get really interesting. What happens then? Do they have to form a coalition government?
Exactly. If no party has enough seats to form a government on their own, they'll need to form a coalition. And that's where things could get unpredictable.
Because they'd have to negotiate and compromise, maybe even with some of those zero parties that Jagdeo was so dismissive of.
Precisely. A hung parliament could force the big parties to work with these smaller parties, giving them a say in shaping the government and its policies.
That could create some interesting power dynamics. Would these coalitions be stable? Or would we see a lot of infighting and instability?
That's the big question. It all depends on how willing the different parties are to compromise and work together. A coalition government could lead to more cooperation and a wider range of voices being heard, but it could also lead to gridlock and instability if the parties can't agree on a shared vision for the country.
So it's a high-stakes game with a lot of moving parts. Are there any other unexpected scenarios we should consider? Any curveballs that could totally change our predictions?
Well, we always have to consider the possibility of unforeseen events. A big scandal, a natural disaster, an economic crisis. Any of these could shake things up and change the election outcome.
So even with all our analysis, there's always an element of surprise in politics. It's what keeps things exciting, right?
Absolutely, and that's what makes this election so fascinating to watch.
Okay, I think we've explored a lot of potential outcomes, but I'm still curious. What do you think is the most likely scenario based on current trends, historical patterns, and the overall political climate? Do you have any predictions?
All right, I'll give you my best guess. But remember, this is just speculation. Guyanese politics is full of surprises. Anything could happen.
I understand. Just give me your best assessment. What's your gut feeling?
Well, based on, everything we've talked about, I think the most likely scenario is a narrow win for the PPPC.
Yeah.
Not a landslide or anything, but enough to keep them in charge.
So a continuation of their rule, but maybe not with like a super strong mandate. That would definitely keep things interesting.
Yeah, exactly. They might face a tougher opposition in parliament, so they'd need to be more willing to compromise on something. It wouldn't be a complete shakeup, but
Yeah.
you could see a shift in the balance of power.
Okay, so a potential shift in dynamics, but not a total overhaul. Of course, you're right. Anything could happen. But that's what makes it so interesting to follow, right? We get to see this political drama unfold.
Absolutely. And regardless of who wins, the challenges facing Guyana are significant.
Yeah.
Managing that oil wealth responsibly, promoting sustainable development, addressing inequality, strengthening democratic institutions. I mean, those are just some of the big issues on the agenda.
Yeah, it sounds like whoever takes charge has their work cut out for them. But this deep dive has given us a really good look at how complex Guyanese politics is. I'm curious for our listeners, why should they care about what's happening in Guyana? How does the story connect to the bigger picture?
That's a key question. Guyana's story is relevant for a few reasons. First, it's like a microcosm of the challenges facing a lot of developing countries, especially those dealing with resource management and political transitions. How Guyana handles these issues could be a good lesson for other nations.
So it's kind of a case study in development and political change, something a lot of countries can learn from.
Exactly. And second, Guyana's growing oil production has global implications, impacting energy markets and even geopolitics. The decisions made in Georgetown, Guyana's capital, could have ripple effects, affecting energy prices and international relations.
That's a really good point. It shows how interconnected we all are. What happens in one part of the world can affect everyone.
Absolutely. And finally, Guyana's journey with democracy, with all its complexities and challenges, gives us valuable insights into the struggle to build a stable and inclusive society. In a diverse and often divided environment, it reminds us that democracy is a process, a constant work in progress.
You've really driven that point home. It's a reminder that what happens in Guyana doesn't stay in Guyana. It affects the region, the global energy scene, and even our understanding of democracy itself.
Exactly. And for our listeners, I think this deep dive is a great starting point for understanding the intricacies of Guyanese politics and its significance on a larger scale.
To our listeners, we encourage you to keep an eye on Guyana. This election is just one chapter in a bigger story. Stay curious and keep exploring this fascinating country. Who knows, you might even become a Guyana expert yourself.
I agree. There's always more to learn and discover. Stay engaged. Ask critical questions. Consider different perspectives. And come to your own conclusions. That's what makes learning so rewarding.
Well said. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into Guyanese politics. We hope you enjoyed it, and we encourage you to keep exploring. Until next time, stay curious.